The movie opens up in the streets of London, where our main character, a homeless man named James Bowen, is performing some songs. He's giving it all he has, but not a single pedestrian gives him attention or money. One of them simply provides him with an unfinished box of sandwiches. At night, James gets hungry, so he reluctantly scavenges the trash cans and eats some leftover food. Later, while he's looking for a place to stay, he runs into his junkie friend, Baz, who inquires about the nearest narcotics dealer. However, James, who has just quit drugs, says that he doesn't know any dealers before walking away. Following this, James enters a restaurant and orders a packet of food. Sadly, when he counts the coins he has in his pocket, it turns out to be insufficient for the meal. He tells the restaurant owner that he will sing a song for the customers in exchange for the remaining amount of money. However, the rude owner throws the food into a sink and angrily asks James to get out of his restaurant. Depressed about what his life has become, James strolls around the empty streets, trying to find a safe place to stay. To his surprise, he again meets Baz, who is sitting inside a car. It's revealed that the car actually belongs to a businessman who parked but forgot to lock its doors. As it is raining outside, James joins him without objecting. He also consumes a small amount of narcotics to forget about his awful day. The following morning, when both James and Baz are still inside the car, the owner arrives there and becomes enraged. Baz somehow manages to get out of the car and flee, but James appears to be unconscious. Seeing this, the owner of the car gets afraid and immediately calls an ambulance to escort James to the nearby hospital. Fortunately, the matter is not so serious and he regains consciousness after a few hours. While he's resting, Val, his emergency social contact and rehabilitation consultant, approaches him. She is angry that James has consumed a prohibited drug, while also missing the medicines that were prescribed to him. In response, James wholeheartedly apologizes to her, saying that it will never happen again. Next, after getting discharged from the hospital, James meets Val at her office. The two discuss his new treatment plan, and Val prescribes him a new dose of methadone. She also strictly warns him to visit her every 2 weeks. After James departs, he heads straight to the streets and starts singing again. Meanwhile, Val talks to her senior about James. She wants to manage a room for him so that he can be off the streets and avoid bad people. To her delight, the senior approves of her idea. Later, Val shares the good news with James, and the latter is delighted that he can now live in a proper apartment. However, Val warns him that he is still required to follow the rehabilitation plan strictly. Later in the evening, while James is taking a bath, he hears a noise coming from the kitchen. Afraid, he wraps a towel around his waist and grabs a shoe before walking into the kitchen to inspect. To his surprise, he finds a small brown cat alongside his box of cereal. Realizing that the cat is hungry and looking for food, James immediately feels connected to the poor animal and offers it some milk. He also lets it spend the night in the house and even sings a lovely song for it. The next morning, James carries the cat and visits door to door in the neighborhood, trying to find its rightful owner. However, none of the neighbors claim the cat, and James is forced to leave it on the streets, hoping it will find its home on its own. After this, James heads to the streets and starts singing songs as usual. Unfortunately, an old man finds it annoying and orders him to leave. While James is packing his belongings, suddenly he notices his father Jack on the other side of the street and rushes to meet him. Here we get to know that James has been abandoned by his family after his father married another woman named Hillary, who hates James's presence. As the father-son duo is conversing, Hillary arrives there and pulls Jack away, saying that she will never invite James to the Christmas celebration. However, before leaving, Jack hands over some money to James and tells him that he might think about inviting him for dinner. Later, when James returns home, he finds the same cat waiting outside. He gently picks it up and notices that it has wounds all over its body. Worried, James contacts his animal-loving neighbor Betty, who suggests he immediately take the cat to a nearby vet clinic. She also gives the cat a name, Bob. Following this, James hurriedly visits the clinic and spends all his money to buy medicines for Bob. He also misses his scheduled meeting with Val. After returning home, James tries to feed the medicines to Bob, but fails miserably. Defeated, he takes him to Betty and asks for her help. The latter has volunteered in the vet clinic several times, so she effortlessly gets the job done. She then starts opening up to James and makes it clear that she hates drugs and the person using them. Hearing this, he lies to Betty about his profession and tells her that he's actually a musician. The next day, James visits Val at her office and apologizes for missing his scheduled meeting. He then begins telling her about his cat and his growing closeness with Betty. However, Val is not convinced that James has recovered enough to start taking on the responsibility of the cat and a girlfriend. She suggests James take care of himself and avoid getting into relationships. Later, James takes Val's advice and drops the cat on the streets. However, when he boards a bus, Bob follows him there and sits on his lap. Everyone inside the bus starts praising the adorable cat, and the ticket collector even gives James shoelaces to use as a leash. After getting off the bus, James carries Bob on his shoulders and walks towards his usual spot. Surprisingly, this time a huge crowd gathers to watch him perform. They also give him generous tips, making it his highest collection. James is ecstatic that he's finally getting recognition and love because of the cat, so he decides to keep it. Before returning home, he also buys proper food for Bob. In the following scene, while James is looking for a location to perform, Baz appears and requests some cash to buy food. James feels sad to see his friend in such a condition and immediately offers him some money out of sympathy before leaving. He then performs and draws a larger audience than the previous instance. In addition to some cat food, an elderly woman also presents Bob with a scarf she recently knitted in remembrance of her late cat. Later that day, James unexpectedly bumps into Betty and invites her out for dinner. To his dismay, Betty mentions that she's a vegan, but nonetheless, she invites James for a meal to her apartment. James obliges, and that night, the two have a lot of fun. On his way back home, he sees Baz lying on the sidewalk unconscious. He walks up to him right away and begs the nearby people to call an ambulance. Sadly, Baz has already died because of an overdose. And when James finally realizes this, he is devastated. Following this, James again visits Betty at her home, where she confesses that her brother was also an addict who overdosed to death. This is why she hates everyone who consumes drugs. Betty telling James about her brother's experience and Baz's sudden demise make James even more determined to abstain from narcotics. During his subsequent meeting with Val, James mentions that he's desperate to stop using narcotics and asks her to reduce his methadone dosage. However, Betty advises him to go carefully and not hurry into quitting narcotics because doing so would be bad for his mental and physical health. Val tells him, though, that if he keeps abstaining from narcotics and taking the recommended amount of methadone, she would soon think about decreasing his methadone dosage. The scene then shifts to James and Betty having a special Christmas together. James even takes Betty out on a date while making a lifetime commitment to her. Later that evening, he makes the decision to go celebrate Christmas at his father's place, and he also carries a bottle of wine as a gift. Unfortunately, despite the fact that he's been drug-free for a very long period, the family treats him like an addict, and even his little stepsisters are disrespectful to him. While James is conversing with his dad, Bob suddenly leaps out of his lap and starts to run around, shattering a pricey flower vase and other things in the process. Because of this, Hillary yells at him and his father, and eventually James gets expelled from the house. The next day, when James is busking in front of a large audience, a dog unexpectedly urinates on his guitar bag. This enrages James, and he starts tussling with the dog owner. After a while, the authorities arrive and detain him for creating chaos in public. Fortunately, the CCTV tape proves that James is innocent, and Val also shows up at the police station to save him. James, however, is prohibited from performing in public for a period of 6 months. Val also notices that he hasn't taken his prescribed daily dose of methadone, so she warns him to start taking them if he wants to keep Bob with him. Afraid to lose his only company, James rushes to the nearby clinic and takes the dosage of methadone. Unbeknownst to him, Betty is also in the same clinic, and she learns that James is actually a heroin addict. Enraged, Betty yells at him and confronts him for lying to her and breaking her trust. Having lost his only source of income and girlfriend, James returns home and later visits a newspaper company to apply for a paper seller job. He is hired by the manager, who also reminds him to limit his paper sales within the boundaries of his assigned region. James then starts selling papers right away and draws strangers who want to take pictures with Bob. Later, as he strolls through the area of another newspaper seller, a couple approaches him, buys a paper, and asks to take a photo with Bob. However, his competitor vendor sees him selling the paper in his region and complains to the newspaper office about it. As a result, James is prohibited from selling papers for a month. After that, James runs into Betty and makes an effort to make amends. However, she is still furious and won't speak to him. James finally runs out of money after a few days, but despite his poor condition, he decides to purchase food for Bob rather than himself. Then, in various locations where the cops won't readily locate him, he starts performing songs by the side of the road. To his bad luck, Betty sees him doing it, and since he's still on probation, she shouts at his stupidity and ends their relationship. After a month, James returns to selling newspapers. One day while on duty, a harsh woman attempts to purchase Bob from him. When James politely rejects, 2 dogs nearby start barking at Bob, frightening him and prompting him to flee. James tries to catch up with the poor animal, but to no avail. For the next few days, he is left alone and upset as Bob still doesn't come home. At one point, he almost reverts to narcotics, but he stops himself at the last second. Thankfully, Bob comes home, and when they reunite, James realizes that he's now prepared to stop using methadone. The next day, James visits Val and asks her to cut loose his methadone dosage. She agrees to his request and advises him to prepare for the withdrawal symptoms. James then meets Betty and informs her about his preparations for a drug detox plan. Hearing this, she becomes happy, and the two finally make amends. Betty also decides to assist James by delivering meals to his room. After suffering through a week of excruciating withdrawal symptoms, James is finally able to stop using drugs. He then visits Betty, only to discover that she's about to move out of the city. Soon, she departs after giving James her new address in the hopes that he will pay her a visit soon. After watching footage of James and Bob performing together, a book writing business contacts James and asks him to write a book on their friendship. Following this, James is introduced to the writing department's chief, who offers him a brand new laptop to start his work. Later, James goes to his father's house to let him know he is drug-free. This makes Jack happy, and he finally acknowledges his fault and apologizes for leaving James behind. In the last scene, James is greeted by a sizable audience at the book launch event, and Val, Jack, and Betty congratulate him on his achievement. James also makes a statement in which he expresses gratitude to everyone who supported him during his challenging life's journey. The movie ends with James and Bob doing what they love most, performing on the streets.